First this morning, Frank Aiken, former Taoiseach, Finance and Foreign Minister, founder member of Fianna Fáil and celebrated anti-partitionist. He was born in Camlock, within what in his lifetime became the northern part of a partitioned Ireland. Here he is at the public meeting in 1949, at an all-party public meeting, protesting at the Government of Ireland Act just passed in the British House of Commons and which followed Ireland's exit from the Commonwealth.
They're here in their thousands, in their tens of thousands, yes, in their hundreds of thousands, to show that however divided we may be on political views, we are united as one man in our determination that there shall be but one Ireland, and that free.
When he died 30 years ago, Proinsias Macanéasa presented an obituary programme. Among the contributors was Todd Andrews.
Dr. Andrews, he had quite a reputation as a fighter in the War of Independence as well, of course.
Oh, more than somewhat. He ambushed the British coming back from the opening of the Sixth County Parliament, but that of King George V, and he killed a lot of soldiers. Just in South Armagh, bandit country, as you would say. He was probably the bandit of the day.
Andrews paid tribute to Aiken's attempts to head off the Civil War in 1922.
When it became evident to everybody that the Civil War was imminent, Frank Aiken hot-footed it down to Dublin here and begged, practically on his knees, Collins, Mulcahy and some of the other ministers whom he knew, of course, quite well, to lay off and stop the fighting in the Dublin, because he said it would spread. But he went back then back to his own. He got no help at all from them, and he went back to Dundalk, where he was occupying the town, of course, as a part of the IRA, and he was hardly back when the Free Staters landing in on top of him and rounding him up and putting him in jail, and that had to do something about it, make up his mind for him. But he blew his way out of jail, blew down the wall, and he got out.
Aiken had been close to De Valera ever since he had travelled to Clare in 1917 to help De Valera in the East Clare by-election.
I was on the run after the Civil War, and the people in Laos put me up as a TD, much although I objected to it, and I was elected.
And Aiken was to be a member of all of De Valera's cabinets. He was an enthusiastic supporter of the development of Irish bogs. Lemass, for instance, had little interest. He was even indifferent. Todd Andrews.
It was he who thought up the development of the bogs in Ireland and urged it on the government. And there was a long story about it. But in any event, nobody had such a chance as we had, because we had what it amounted to a minister on our board. In other words, he and Aiken O'Reilly and myself and himself used to meet 2 or 3 times a week, all during the setting up of the bogs. But it was he had the government. He produced the government support, which he wouldn't have got from the civil service if he wasn't a minister.
When Frank Aiken's death was announced just 30 years ago, Conor Cruise O'Brien was in studio on another subject, and this was his response.
I worked very closely with him for 4 years, from 1957 to 1961, at the United Nations, in which he took a great interest and to which he made an important contribution. At the United Nations, he was one of the most respected members representing any small country there, and made, I think, a greater impact in that institution than perhaps any other Irish foreign minister.
Also, we've a commitment towards disarmament. He was the person who introduced the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Test Ban Treaty in the United Nations.
Fianna Fáil colleague and sometimes successor as Foreign Minister, Brian Lenihan.
Furthermore, he showed remarkable foresight and courage in adopting the very proper stance of admitting China to the United Nations long before it became fashionable and before the United States finally moved in that direction.
I always thought it was common sense, that it made common sense that China should be in the United Nations along with Russia and the other communist countries.
Well, in my opinion, Frank Aiken was a patriot in the traditional mould.
Jack Lynch, third leader of Fianna Fáil, who included the veteran Frank Aiken as his first foreign minister.
He was intensely loyal to his ideals, be they Republican, cultural or otherwise, and certainly loyal to those with whom he shared these ideals. Perhaps to no person more than to Eamon de Valera, his late chief, with whom he had, in my opinion, a closer relationship than any other of Dev's contemporaries had. In my opinion, his other great characteristic, as I observed him, was his tenacity. He was tenacious, as many people know, in his belief in the restoration of the language. His tenacity was evident in his insistence on the development of the Irish bogs for economic and social development. He was tenacious too in ensuring our absolute neutrality during the Second World War, when he was responsible for censorship and other things like that in his capacity as the Minister for the Coordination of Defensive Measures. And he was particularly tenacious and committed in his campaign during his UN days for the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons.
Frank Aiken was close to De Valera, probably the closest of all Fianna Fáil ministers, and shared De Valera's championing of the goal of the restoration of the Irish language. Todd Andrews.
He wasn't the very most marvellous linguist, but it wasn't with a want of effort.
Well, the government are very willing to help in any way, and to accept any suggestion that would restore Irish as a spoken language, and particularly to save the Gaeltacht. But the Gaeltacht can't save Irish. It's the rest of the country. If they would do it in Irish and speak more Irish and try to get their children to speak more Irish, that would be a great help and would be a great moral assistance to the people in the Gaeltacht, and an encouragement to them to keep the language alive.
Aiken served as a minister in all of De Valera's governments from 1932 to 1959, and in both the Lemass governments then to 1966. In the 1960s, Aiken was critical of what he thought was an over-close relationship between Fianna Fáil and big business, and he forbade entry to his Louth constituency of any of the Taca supporters of the party. He was then a member of Jack Lynch's first government.
He was not a very affable man in ordinary contact, but he was a tender man. He was kind to friends. He had a good sense of humour, and I know that he was a very loving father and a devoted husband, because I often heard him talk about his wife and his children.
In listening to Jack Lynch's tribute, some factors should be borne in mind. Aiken had served in Lynch's first cabinet until 1969 and was a moderate on northern policy at a time when the Troubles were beginning and causing considerable difficulty for Jack Lynch. Aiken was then surprised to be dropped by Lynch when he formed his cabinet after the 1969 election. But as a backbencher, Aiken remained an advisor to Lynch and was especially antipathetic to Charles Haughey. Aiken hated him like poison, according to Kevin Boland. Aiken's mistrust of Haughey was such that he told Lynch that he would not stand in the 1973 election if Haughey, and this was post-arms trial acquittal, if Haughey was ratified by Fianna Fáil as a candidate, and that Aiken would announce this publicly to the media. He would even suggest that Fianna Fáil should invite John Hume or Austin Curry to run in Louth as independents. Lynch had to recruit De Valera, Sean McEntee and George Colley to persuade Aiken to withdraw this threat and instead announce that he was retiring on medical grounds.
And I do know that when his wife Maudie was killed tragically, it affected him terribly. Frank Aiken aged considerably, and even though he was an old man when he died, I think he was getting more quickly feeble immediately after Maudie's death than he otherwise would have done.
Aiken was even more annoyed when Lynch brought Haughey back to the Fianna Fáil front bench in January 1975, and thereafter Aiken never attended an Ard Fheis or any Fianna Fáil event. But he lived to see Haughey win the Fianna Fáil leadership against George Colley. Aiken then went to special lengths to ensure that Charles Haughey would not make the graveside oration over his coffin. As party leader at the time, Haughey would have been the automatic choice.
He certainly embarked on a major initiative in regard to Ireland becoming very active in international affairs in the cause of world peace and the peaceful settlement of international disputes.
But Charles Haughey was invited by Proinsias Maconíosa to give the final word to the obituary programme on Frank Aiken.
Is he a great loss to Fianna Fáil? Was he a great loss when he stopped being TD in 1973?
And bear in mind that Aiken had quit in 1973 explicitly because Haughey had been endorsed as a Fianna Fáil candidate post the arms trial.
He was a great loss insofar as he represented a very definite and distinct tradition and a very definite link with the past, a very clear-cut link with the Republican origins of Fianna Fáil. But then he had a very long period of service in the Dáil, over 50 years. So from the point of view of constituency politics, the continuity went on, but the main change insofar as his leaving the scene at that time was concerned would be that it was another link, if you like, with the great era of the 30s, which was broken.
Now, like yourself, he had a very strong northern background. In fact, he was a northerner, and on Friday he will be buried in Armagh, near where he was born. Do you feel that affected him? Do you think that coloured his outlook and brought about his great commitment to a united Ireland?
Undoubtedly, yes. He came from a very important part of the country insofar as the national policy of unity is concerned. If you like, he was very much in the firing line because that County Louth, Armagh part of the country, I suppose, reflects more than most other parts of the country the enormity that the border represents. Perhaps only in Donegal is the thing brought out in the same way, that the people in Armagh and the people south of Armagh around County Louth are exactly the same type of people, and that the border is seen very clearly there to be total nonsense.
Do you think there's anyone in politics today that in any way identifies with his view on Ireland as a whole, of an all-Ireland state, an all-Ireland nation?
Well, we would certainly like to think that in Fianna Fáil today we are very firmly committed to the same ideals and principles of a united Ireland that he upheld, and that we maintain that as a central policy and a central national objective, so that from that point of view we would like to think that we are in direct line of succession today to the policies which he upheld, and indeed to the beliefs to which he was committed.
We leave the last word on Frank Aiken to Todd Andrews. In his Man of No Property, he described Aiken as a brave soldier and a competent one. No man had felt so deeply about the split on the treaty, and no man tried harder to prevent the civil war. Aiken had, said Andrews, unlimited patience and unusual capacity for detail. He was indifferent to the opinions of either his political friends or opponents, or indeed to anyone except De Valera. He could not be insulted because he was never aware of an insult being offered. He was not sensitive to the feelings of others, nor could he be intimidated. Aiken, he said, was a man of ingenuity and imagination. He was the last of the Sinn Féiners.
Yes, I think I already described him as the last of the Sinn Féiners, of that variety of republicanism which is really encapsulated in De Valera's famous speech about the frugal comfort. He was that kind of a Sinn Féiner. Oh, he's a complete Republican.
Todd Andrews and others on Frank Aiken, who died just 30 years ago.